Statistics show that in a life-threatening crisis, the human body is wired for a violent surge of adrenaline, sending heart rates skyrocketing past 180 beats per minute. Most people succumb to the primal urge to scream, to tremble, or to plead for mercy. But at 3:00 a.m. on a rain-slicked Monday inside a flickering diner on the edge of the city, Zaria Cole broke every rule of human nature. When a sawed-off shotgun was jammed against her temple, Zaria didn't gasp. She didn't even stop pouring the coffee. Her hands remained as steady as the rhythmic hum of the neon sign outside, her dark, stoic eyes reflecting nothing but a weary detachment. She simply looked at the masked man through the steam of the brew and asked if he wanted cream and sugar with his performance. It was a display of ice, so absolute it froze the air in the room. Watching this from the shadows of a corner booth was Kenji Sato, a man whose own life was built on the currency of fear. He had seen hardened soldiers break under less pressure, yet here was a waitress in a faded gray uniform who didn't even blink at the face of death. Zaria was only 24, but her gaze held the weight of 1,000 years, stripped of the youthful sparkle society expected of a woman her age. For 3 years, the diner had been her sanctuary of invisibility, a place where she could exist as a ghost in an apron while she fought to build a future for her brother. She had learned long ago that when the world is constantly trying to break you, the only way to survive is to stop feeling the impact. The diner was nearly empty. A few night shift workers sat hunched over cold plates, their faces buried in their phones, oblivious to the shift in the atmosphere. But in booth 4, the man in the tailored black suit had finally pushed his plate aside. Kenji Sato didn't look away. He stood up slowly, captivated by the mystery of a soul so detached from terror that it had become the most dangerous thing in the room. The tension in the diner didn't just break, it shattered. Kenji Sato moved with a predatory speed that made the air feel thin. Before the lead gunman could even register the shift in the room, Kenji was there, his hand wrapping around the shotgun's barrel and jerking it upward toward the water-stained ceiling. The blast was deafening, a roar of fire that peppered the tiles with buckshot, but Zaria didn't so much as duck. In a blur of tailored black wool and focused violence, Kenji struck. A palm to the throat, a knee to the ribs, and the leader was on the floor, gasping for air that his lungs could no longer find. The other 2 robbers hesitated, a fatal mistake. Kenji didn't use a weapon, he was the weapon. He moved through them like a shadow through a graveyard, leaving them crumpled among the overturned chairs and spilled sugar. Throughout the chaos, Zaria simply set the coffee pot back on its warming plate. She didn't call for help, and she didn't hide. She watched the display of high-level martial precision with the same flat, clinical gaze she used to count out change at the end of a shift. Kenji straightened his dark dress shirt, his breathing barely elevated. He looked down at the 3 men groaning on the linoleum, then turned his gaze to the woman behind the counter. The intense, dark depths of his eyes were locked on her, searching for the crack in her armor, the tremble in the hand, the dilation of the pupils, the catch in the breath. There was nothing. He walked to the counter, his presence heavy with a silent, commanding authority that usually made men drop their gaze. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of crisp bills, fanning them out onto the formica surface. $100 bills sat beside a cold coffee ring. It was more than Zaria made in 2 months of doubles. "The register is safe," Kenji said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to cut through the ringing in the air. He leaned forward, his sharp features inches from hers, his eyes burning with a sudden, dangerous curiosity. "But you're the most interesting thing I've seen in this city." Zaria didn't look at the money. She looked at him, her face a mask of perfect, chilling stillness. "I'm just a waitress, Mr. Sato," she replied, her voice steady. "And you're just a customer who hasn't touched his food." Kenji didn't smile, but a glint of something like respect sparked in his eyes. He tapped the stack of cash. "That's for the coffee. And this," he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper, "is for the answer. Why weren't you afraid? Why didn't you flinch?" Zaria met his gaze, her own eyes older and colder than any man in the room. "Because, Mr. Sato," she whispered back, "you can't frighten someone who has already lost everything that mattered." Kenji didn't say another word. He simply turned and walked into the rain, the question, and the woman already beginning to haunt him. The heavy stack of bills felt like a lead weight in Zaria's pocket as she stepped out of the diner and into the biting chill of the pre-dawn air. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle, soaking into her thin gray uniform and chilling her to the bone. She walked with her head down, not out of fear, but out of a practiced habit of remaining a ghost in a city that preferred its poor to be transparent. Her apartment building in Dorchester was a monument to neglect, a brick husk where the elevator had been out of service since the previous winter. Zaria climbed the 4 flights of stairs, her boots echoing in the hollow hallway. Inside the cramped studio, the air was thick with the smell of damp plaster and the low hum of a space heater that barely fought off the draft. She moved softly toward the corner, where her younger brother, Malik, lay asleep on a pallet. At 18, his face still held the softness their childhood had lacked, a fragile piece that Zaria would burn the world to protect. Beside him lay his textbooks, heavy, expensive volumes on engineering that represented their only way out. Zaria sat at the small kitchen table, pulling the $1,000 from her pocket. It was a lifeline, but in this neighborhood, money often felt like bait. Her hand drifted to a stack of crumpled notices on the counter, final warnings from Vane Properties. Marcus Vane didn't just want the rent. He wanted the entire block cleared for his urban revitalization project, and he was using every shadow-drenched tactic to make it happen. A sudden, sharp thud against the door made her spine turn to ice. It wasn't a knock, it was a kick. "Cole, open up," a voice rasped through the wood, followed by the heavy rattle of the doorknob. "We know you're in there. Marcus wants to know if you've reconsidered the buyout." Malik stirred, his eyes snapping open in the dim light, wide with a familiar, localized terror. Zaria didn't move toward the door. She stood up slowly, her body blocking her brother from view. She didn't grab a knife or a phone. She simply stared at the door with that same chilling, detached stillness she had shown the gunman in the diner. "The answer is still no," she said, her voice low and perfectly even. A mocking laugh erupted from the hallway. "You're playing a dangerous game, girl. Accidental fires happen in buildings this old. Think about your brother." The footsteps eventually receded, leaving behind a silence that was louder than the threats. Malik sat up, his voice trembling. "Zaria, maybe we should just go. It's just a room." Zaria looked at her brother, her eyes hard and ancient. "It's not a room, Malik. It's the last thing Dad left us. I'm not letting them erase us." She turned back to the window, watching the rain smear the streetlights. She thought of the man in the diner, Kenji Sato, and the way he had stood up. For the first time in years, the invisibility she had used as armor felt like it was starting to crack, and in its place, a cold, sharp resolve was beginning to crystallize. One way or another, the invisible girl was going to be seen. The following night, the rain had turned into a thick, low-hanging mist that swallowed the streetlights of South Boston. Zaria stepped out of the diner's service entrance, the heavy iron door clanging shut behind her with a finality that echoed her exhaustion. Her shift had been grueling, the air in the diner still thick with the whispered rumors of the previous night's violence. She didn't get more than 10 paces before she saw it, a sleek, obsidian black sedan idling at the curb, its engine a low, predatory hum. Leaning against the hood was Kenji Sato. He had traded his suit jacket for a long, dark overcoat, but the aura of absolute authority remained unchanged. He looked out of place in the grime of the alleyway, a diamond dropped in a coal mine. Zaria didn't stop walking. She didn't speed up. She simply tightened her grip on her bag, her expression remaining as flat and unreadable as a frozen lake. "You're late, Zaria," Kenji said, his voice cutting through the fog with effortless clarity. "The floors don't scrub themselves, Mr. Sato," she replied, coming to a halt a few feet from him. She didn't look up at him with the wide-eyed wonder most people reserved for men of his stature. She looked at him like he was a complication she didn't have time for. Kenji straightened, his eyes scanning her face with that same unsettling intensity. "I spent the day looking into you. You live in a building owned by a man who burns his tenants out for insurance money. You work 12-hour doubles to pay for an engineering degree that isn't even yours. And yet, when a man puts a gun to your head, you offer him pie." "I told you, I'm just a waitress," Zaria stated, her voice devoid of defensive edge. No, Kenji stepped into her space, his height casting a long shadow over her. You're a wolf wearing a greased apron because it's the only way to keep the world from biting back. But the world is biting anyway, isn't it? Marcus Vane's dogs were at your door this morning. For the first time, a flicker of something sharp crossed Zaria's eyes. Not fear, but a cold, lethal recognition. I have a place, Kenji continued, his tone dropping to a low, persuasive vibration. A high-end lounge where the people are more dangerous than diner robbers, but the pay is enough to buy that building and burn it down yourself. I don't need a waitress who begs. I need someone who can stare down the devil and ask him for his order. Zaria looked at the car, then back at the man who represented a world she had spent her life avoiding. Why me? Because, Kenji said, reaching out to open the car door for her, I'm tired of being the only person in the room who isn't afraid. Come work for me, Zaria. Stop being invisible and start being inevitable. Zaria looked at the dark leather interior of the car, a portal to a life of power, and then at her own stained, gray sleeves. Slowly, she stepped toward the car. The waitress was still there, but as she sat down, the predator inside her finally began to wake up. The transition from the grease-stained floors of the diner to the obsidian corridors of Kenji's world was supposed to be a sanctuary, but for Zaria, the air always felt like the calm before a different kind of storm. She was leaving her first shift at the Onyx Lounge, her feet aching in new, polished shoes, when her phone vibrated with a frantic energy that made her blood turn to slush. It was Malik. She didn't wait for a car. She ran. When she reached the Dorchester brownstone, the front door wasn't just open. It had been kicked off its hinges, hanging like a broken wing. Inside, the smell of cheap cologne and damp plaster greeted her. Malik was pinned against the kitchen counter by two men in expensive, ill-fitting suits, Marcus Vane's acquisition team. Standing at the center of the small room was Marcus himself, looking disgusted by the very air he was breathing. I warned you about playing games, Zaria, Marcus said, his voice smooth and oily like a spill on asphalt. He leaned over Malik, tapping a heavy gold ring against her brother's temple. This building is coming down. I can do it with you in a nice new apartment, or I can do it with your brother buried in the foundation. Which is it? For the first time in years, the ice in Zaria's veins began to crack. She saw Malik's lip bleeding, saw the terror in his eyes that no amount of her protection had been able to prevent. Her hands, usually so steady, began to tremble at her sides. The dissociation that had been her armor was failing. She was about to scream, to beg, to trade her soul just to make Marcus stop touching her brother. Let him go, she choked out, her voice fracturing. Please. Marcus smirked, savoring the sound of her breaking. Finally, the Ice Queen melts. But the smirk didn't last. From the dark hallway behind Zaria, a shadow detached itself from the gloom. Then another. Two men in sharp, charcoal suits stepped into the light, their faces as expressionless as stone. They didn't shout. They simply occupied the space with a lethal, practiced stillness that made Marcus's thugs look like children playing with matches. Mr. Sato doesn't like his employees being distracted by domestic disputes, one of the men said, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. He didn't pull a weapon. He didn't have to. He simply held up a phone, the screen showing a live feed of Marcus Vane's own children walking home from school. The color drained from Marcus's face so fast it was as if he'd been struck. He backed away from Malik, his hands rising in an instinctive, trembling surrender. The thugs followed suit, their bravado evaporating in the presence of the real monsters in the room. Zaria rushed to Malik, pulling him into her arms. She looked over his shoulder at Kenji's men. They didn't offer comfort. They simply stood there, a silent, ironclad reminder that she was no longer an invisible girl fighting a lone war. She was part of a different shadow now. Get out, Zaria whispered, her voice regaining its cold, sharp edge as she looked at Marcus. And pray he doesn't decide I'm worth more to him than you are. The transition from the drafty halls of Dorchester to the velvet-lined walls of the Onyx Lounge was a sensory assault. The air here didn't smell of damp plaster and desperation. It smelled of expensive oud, aged scotch, and the quiet, vibrating hum of absolute power. Zaria stood at the edge of the VIP balcony, her new uniform a sharp, tailored black suit that hugged her lean frame like armor. For the first time in her life, she wasn't wearing an apron designed to make her blend into the wallpaper. "You're hiding in the corners again, Zaria," Kenji's voice drifted from the shadows behind her. He stepped into the light, looking out over the floor where city councilmen and captains of industry drank under his watchful eye. A waitress hides so she isn't blamed for the mess. A manager stands where everyone can see her, so no one dares to make one. Zaria tightened her grip on the iron railing, her knuckles pale. "Being seen is what gets people like me hurt, Mr. Sato. Invisibility was the only thing that kept me and Malik alive this long." Kenji moved closer, his presence a warm weight against the cool air of the lounge. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gesture toward the crowd below. "Invisibility is just a slow death. It's waiting for the world to notice you've stopped breathing. Power is making the world hold its breath when you walk in." He handed her a small, encrypted tablet, the digital pulse of the Onyx. "From tonight, you are the floor manager. You oversee the security, the intake, and the donations. If a man raises his voice, you don't look at the floor. You look at him until he remembers whose house he's in." Zaria looked down at the screen, seeing the names of the very men who had looked through her for years. "And if they don't remember?" "Then you remind them," Kenji said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. "You don't need to be afraid of the light, Zaria. I own the light in this room, and I'm giving it to you." Zaria took a breath, feeling the dissociation that had protected her for so long begin to shift. It was being replaced by something sharper, something that felt like the edge of a blade. She looked down at the lounge, not as a ghost, but as the person in charge of the shadows. She stepped away from the railing and walked toward the center of the balcony, her heels clicking with a new, deliberate rhythm. She wasn't just surviving the night anymore, she was beginning to rule it. For the first time, Zaria Cole wasn't looking for an exit. She was looking for an empire. The transition from managing the floor to managing the secrets of the Sato Empire felt like stepping from one shadow into another. But this time, Zaria held the flashlight. She sat in the dim light of Kenji's private office, the heavy scent of sandalwood and old paper hanging in the air. Spread across the mahogany desk wasn't a tray of drinks, but a chaotic map of tax returns, deed transfers, and corporate filings. "Vane isn't just a bully," Zaria said, her voice a low, steady hum as she tapped a highlighter against a specific line of text. "He's a ghost. He doesn't buy land. He lets companies that don't exist buy it for him." Kenji leaned over her shoulder, his presence a grounding force against the mounting frustration of the hunt. He watched as her eyes, the eyes he once thought were merely dead, danced with a sharp, analytical fire. She wasn't just reading numbers, she was hunting. "Look at this," she whispered, tracing a finger down a column of shell companies. "Blue Harbor Holdings, Crimson Oak Trust, Silver Spire LLC. They all have different addresses, but they all share the same registered agent, a law firm that went bankrupt 6 years ago." She looked up at Kenji, a faint, cold smirk touching her lips for the first time. "He's using a dead firm to sign for the properties. It's why the city can't track him when the buildings accidentally catch fire. To the law, Marcus Vane isn't even there." Kenji's hand moved to the desk, hovering near hers. "You found the bridge he's been hiding under." "I grew up in those buildings, Kenji," Zaria replied, her voice hardening with a renewed sense of purpose. "I know how guys like Vane hide. They think people like me are too tired to look up, too exhausted to read the fine print. They count on our invisibility to act as their camouflage." She pulled another document from the stack, a list of signatures. "He's forged the signatures of deceased tenants to authorize the buyouts. If we can link these digital footprints back to his personal server, we don't just stop the eviction. We take everything he's ever built." Kenji looked at her, truly seeing her, not as a victim he had rescued, but as the strategist who was about to dismantle an empire. The waitress who hadn't flinched at a shotgun was now staring down a billion-dollar criminal enterprise with the same unshakable resolve. "The paper trail is a noose, Kenji," she said, leaning back in the leather chair, her silhouette sharp against the city lights. And I just found the end of the rope. Then let's pull it, Kenji murmured, his eyes reflecting the cold, brilliant light of the woman who had finally decided to be seen. The predator doesn't like it when the prey learns to bite back. Marcus Vane had realized the paper trail was tightening around his throat, and like any cornered animal, he lashed out with blunt, desperate force. Zaria was leaving the Onyx lounge through the private rear exit when the scent of ozone and wet pavement was suddenly eclipsed by the stench of stale tobacco and sweat. Two men emerged from the mouth of the alley, their movements jagged and hurried. Before she could reach for the alarm in her pocket, a heavy hand clamped over her mouth, and the cold bite of a knife pressed against her ribs. "Don't make a sound, Ice Queen," a voice hissed. "Vane wants to have a long talk about those files you've been digging through." They shoved her into the back of a nondescript van, zip-tying her wrists with a brutal snap. Most women would have screamed. Most victims would have hyperventilated until they lost consciousness. But as the van sped away into the labyrinth of Boston's industrial district, Zaria simply sat back against the cold metal wall. Her breathing remained rhythmic, her pulse steady. She looked at her captors with a gaze so detached it made the man holding the knife visibly twitchy. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice a low, clinical vibration that cut through the roar of the engine. "Shut up," the driver barked, glancing nervously at the rearview mirror. "Marcus is broke," Zaria continued, ignoring him. "The shell companies are frozen. The accounts are flagged by the IRS. He can't pay you for this. In fact, by the time we reach the warehouse, he'll probably have skipped the state, leaving you two to hold the bag for a kidnapping charge that carries 25 to life." The man with the knife gripped the handle tighter. "She's lying. She's just trying to get in our heads." "Check your phones," Zaria challenged, her eyes never leaving his. "See if he answers your texts. See if the bonus he promised hit your accounts. Or better yet, look behind you." Just as the driver glanced back, a black sedan tore through the fog, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin scythes. A second car swerved from a side street, boxing the van in. The screech of tires echoed off the brick warehouses as the van was forced to a bone-jarring halt. The back doors were ripped open, and the night air rushed in, accompanied by the terrifying silhouette of Kenji Sato. He didn't look like a businessman anymore. He looked like a god of retribution. He stepped into the van, ignoring the kidnappers entirely, his eyes focused solely on Zaria. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I'm fine, Kenji," Zaria replied, holding up her bound wrists. Her voice hadn't gone up a single decibel. "They were just telling me how Marcus can't afford their services anymore." Kenji reached down, a flick of his pocket knife severing her ties. He helped her to her feet, his touch surprisingly gentle amidst the violence of the moment. Behind him, his men were already cleaning up, dragging the two kidnappers into the shadows of the warehouse. "You shouldn't have been alone," Kenji murmured, his hand lingering on her arm. "I wasn't," Zaria said, finally allowing a small, sharp smile to touch her lips. "I was just waiting for the trash to collect itself." She stepped out of the van, the rain washing away the scent of the struggle. The invisible girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew exactly how much power lived in the silence. The glass doors of Vane Properties didn't just open. They seemed to surrender as Zaria stepped through them. She was no longer wearing the gray cotton of a waitress or the utilitarian suit of a floor manager. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer that sharpened her silhouette into a blade, her natural hair styled into a crown that demanded the room's attention. Behind her, two of Kenji's men followed in silent, rhythmic lockstep, their presence a physical manifestation of the storm she had brought with her. The receptionist began to stammer a protest, but Zaria didn't slow down. She moved past the polished mahogany desks and the fake smiles of corporate success, heading straight for the double oak doors at the end of the hall. She kicked them open with a single, sharp click of her heel. Inside, Marcus Vane was mid-sentence, flanked by lawyers who looked like vultures in expensive silk. He jumped, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "How dare you? I've already filed a restraining order. Security." "Security is busy reconsidering their career choices," Zaria said, her voice a low, terrifyingly calm vibration. She walked to the center of the boardroom table, the very place where Vane had signed away the futures of hundreds of families. She didn't throw the folder. She placed it down with a slow, deliberate precision that made the lawyers lean back in their chairs. "These are the original deeds to the Dorchester block, Marcus," she said, her eyes locked onto his, as cold and unblinking as they had been under the shotgun's barrel. "Along with the forensic audit of Blue Harbor Holdings, the IRS has already seized your offshore accounts. The city has revoked your permits, and the DA is currently reviewing the forged signatures of 10 deceased tenants." Vane reached for the papers, his hands shaking so violently the staples rattled. "You're bluffing. You're just a girl from a diner." "I was a girl who saw everything because you thought I was nothing," Zaria countered. "I was the invisible witness to every crime you committed. Kenji Sato could have ended you in an alley, but I wanted you to see the face of the person who actually pulled the trigger." Kenji appeared in the doorway then, his silhouette leaning casually against the frame. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The shift in the room was absolute. Vane looked from the powerful man in the doorway to the woman standing over his desk and realized the terrifying truth. The man had provided the hammer, but the woman had built the gallows. "Pack your things, Marcus," Zaria whispered, leaning over the table until she was inches from his face. "You're being evicted." As she turned and walked out, she didn't look back at the ruin she had left behind. She walked toward Kenji, her chin high, finally realizing that true power wasn't just staying calm in the dark, it was owning the light. 6 months later, the early morning sun did not feel like a threat or a reminder of a night shift ended. It felt like a beginning. Zaria stood in the center of a refurbished brick building in the heart of Dorchester, the very neighborhood where she had once fought to remain a ghost. The air no longer smelled of damp plaster and fear. It smelled of fresh paint, hope, and the lavender bushes she had insisted on planting by the entrance. A sleek brass plaque by the door read, "The Cole Sato Community Foundation." It wasn't a front for the underworld, but a fortress for the people Marcus Vane had tried to erase. As the director, Zaria didn't wear a greased apron or a tailored suit meant for combat. She wore a soft, emerald green silk dress that complemented the warmth finally returning to her skin. Beside her, Kenji stood with his hands in his pockets, his usual lethal intensity softened by a quiet, pervasive pride. He wasn't watching the crowd of local families and students who had gathered for the opening. He was watching her. "The neighborhood looks different from this height, doesn't it?" Kenji murmured, his voice a low, steady anchor. Zaria looked at the rows of houses that were now protected by legal trusts she had helped design. "It looks like a place where people can breathe," she replied. She looked at her hands, the same hands that had steadily poured coffee while a shotgun was leveled at her head. They weren't shaking now, but they weren't cold anymore either. They were alive. Malik ran up to them, his